Okay, video's going. Let's hope it keeps going now. Let me do a really rough recap of everything that I was just saying. We're going to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women today. One of the things that I think is really cool about it is that there's a conservative streak running right through it, but fill in the gap. I just said it a couple minutes ago. Yeah, that conservative streak actually kind of like hides a really sort of a radical progressive sort of argument that we can pull out of this that goes well beyond, in the ways that it might sell women short, it might go well beyond the application of this sort of argument to it might go well beyond the application to just women. It might include all sorts of folks who aren't served very well by our usual understandings of how liberal democracy ought to work. So there's a reflection draft that's posted. You'll have until Tuesday to finish it. And that reflection draft asks, does the early modern political philosophical project provide us with enough to have a roadmap to a just society? It's very, very tempting to say yes, because it matches a lot of our contemporary intuitions about what a good society looks like, especially if we assume that we have one right now, that we're living in a society that is more or less a just democracy, or if we assume that the shortcomings are just shortcomings in application of ideas. The ideas are all there already. We've got it all figured out by the time we get through all of the social contract theorists. But it's just maybe difficult to apply those ideas. So we might say theoretically we're there, but perhaps in sort of the practicalities of real politic, we might not be there. But that doesn't mean, so we might say, we don't need to do any more philosophical work. I think that that's not entirely true. I think that there are still some really vexing political, philosophical problems. The question that I'm wondering about, and why I give the prompt that I do, is, are they the sorts of problems that we can figure out with the tools of modernity? And one of the ways in which we might get a tantalizing sense of maybe, and I'll confess, the first time I taught this class, I was ready to say that there are some big, big oversights in early modern political philosophy, such that by the time we get all the way through Kant and even Mary Wollstonecraft, I'll say we still haven't finished the project yet. There's lots of stuff still to be done. And maybe it has to do with getting beyond modernity to some other form of political thought. But vis-a-vis this thing that I just said, this kind of hidden radical argument in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, maybe, I think Mary Wollstonecraft surprised me the first time that I read her in the context of this class by kind of making me think a little bit differently about what it is that modern political philosophical tools are capable of. Okay. That's a whole lot of preamble. I probably said more in the bit that I did that didn't get recorded, but let's not waste any more time on that. Let's jump right into talking about Mary Wollstonecraft and her life, which is a remarkable life. You could make a movie about this. It would be a great movie, I think, mostly because it's a little bit of a tragedy. Mary Wollstonecraft was born. Do I have when she's born? No, I didn't have not in my notes when she's born. Mary Wollstonecraft is born into a somewhat aristocratic, I'm not sure if that's into a family of the leisure class, which is to say, they didn't have to work. They had enough money. The family had enough money that there was no reason for them to have to work, or they kind of think in terms of some of the British. What's that TV show that was very popular on Downton Abbey? Yeah, I think Downton Abbey kind of style where people do stuff, but they don't really have careers, and they have servants that take care of all of the menial domestic sort of tasks for them. People might go to war, and they might seek political office or things like that. They might become philosophers. They might engage in a society of letters. They don't really have jobs in the way that you and I might think of jobs today. That said, Mary Wollstonecraft's father was a bit of a gambler. Not playing cards or dice or that sort of thing gambler. He made risky investments, and he wasn't very good at it, and was constantly losing the family's money. So they were constantly teetering on this edge of falling out of this leisure class and down into a labor class. On top of that, Mary Wollstonecraft's father drank to excess. We were talking about that a little bit today. Drank to excess and was mercilessly physically abusive of Mary Wollstonecraft's mother. Wollstonecraft writes later on in her life of like fairly vivid descriptions of these sorts of experiences when she was a child, talks about like trying to insinuate herself between her father and her mother as a young girl, which is a like very dangerous and scary sort of thing to do, and as you might imagine, is the sort of thing that might significantly affect somebody's psyche about like what the sorts of relationships between domestic relationships between men and women can be like, and perhaps what they ought to be like. As Mary Wollstonecraft gets older, her younger sister, ends up in a relationship that is, it's not clear if it was abusive, it certainly wasn't good. Her sister has a child. After having the child, in a bout of postpartum depression, the postpartum depression on the part of Mary's sister, Mary Wollstonecraft convinces her sister to leave her husband, says, this is no good for you, like take your child and get out of there. And her sister takes her advice and eventually leaves her husband, and this is devastating to her sister's life from then on. She never really manages to marry. She never really manages to get out of poverty as a result of this. Basically, the stark reality of England at the time that Mary Wollstonecraft was like growing up, and in the time that her sister had left her husband, was such that a woman was not really capable of taking care of herself. We saw something in chapter 3. It was on the homework quiz about widows, right? There's this kind of hypothetical scenario of single mothers and like how it is that they're going to be able to try to raise children on their own, and to kind of perhaps take away any sort of blame that somebody might use to like put on a young mother to say like, well, perhaps it's your own fault that you're single. She uses the example of like a woman whose husband dies, which is the sort of thing that just happens and like through nobody's fault. But presumably a young woman's going to have to be able to like handle this sort of a thing. And Mary Wollstonecraft talks about like, is she going to be able to handle it if she's prepared for life in the way that women are currently prepared for life? And Mary Wollstonecraft got a very stark sort of a demonstration of the idea that like, no, they are not, at least not as women are currently educated and brought up, in the form of her younger sister. Shortly after that, Mary Wollstonecraft gets into books and learning. She works as a domestic servant for a much wealthier woman and eventually becomes a governess for her children and kind of bounces around to a couple of places, becoming a governess for young children. Think like Maria von Trapp, kind of like half teacher, half like caretaker sort of a thing. For a small group of children in like the home of a wealthy benefactor. During this time, Mary Wollstonecraft starts writing some stuff on education. Really great stuff if you want to go check that out from her younger days, things that she's written on education, including a collection of fictional stories that kind of give little lessons. All of these stories are interactions between a bunch of young women and their teacher/governess. And you can see like Mary Wollstonecraft is kind of like modeling perhaps things that actually happened in her own experience about what the best way to raise young women looks like. And this is like early in her career before she gets into this sort of stuff. She thinks very seriously about opening up a school, starts getting into the idea of like national compulsory education. She meets up with some other folks who are kind of like-minded, other governesses who are interested in this idea, is on the verge of opening up her own school, and then the people that she's working with, the main woman that she's working with, her partner in this, gets sick and eventually dies, and that whole plan falls apart. Around this time, Mary Wollstonecraft writes A Vindication of the Rights of Men, not A Vindication of the Rights of Women. So somewhere around, I guess, like 1790-ish, she writes, 1791, I think, writes The Vindication of the Rights of Men. This is in response to the French Revolution, which starts in 1789. And England is watching this French Revolution with rapt attention and kind of thinking to themselves like, wow, here we have a democratic overthrow of the monarchy. This is the sort of thing that could happen in England. Do we think this is a good thing? Do we think this is a bad thing? There's plenty of commentary from British thinkers, including Edmund Burke, that it's a bad thing or that it at least needs to be taken very cautiously. And Mary Wollstonecraft writes a response to Burke in The Vindication of the Rights of Man, or Men? I think it's Vindication of the Rights of Men. Vindication of the rights of woman, singular. Vindication of the rights of men, plural. Yeah, go figure that. I don't know. It confuses me. I lose track sometimes. In support of the French Revolution. This ends up being a little bit short-sighted, I suppose, because I don't know if you got, like, how good is your history, like your French history? How does that French Revolution turn out? Like, they successfully overthrow the king, and they end up killing him. That happens in England as well, right? We saw that in the English Civil War. But shortly after that revolution, we have what's usually referred to as the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 94, where somewhere on the order of 40,000 people get executed, mostly by guillotine. It's not called the Reign of Terror just for yucks. It is like, it's the kind of mob mentality that we would expect from a Hobbesian description of what happens when you remove the sovereign. That, like, we just kind of fall right back into the state of nature. And for those of us who might be a little bit skeptical of the sorts of arguments that Hobbes makes about that, and we might think, like, oh, maybe Locke's got a better case, that, like, we can leave a civil government if it's not really serving us, if it's not a legitimate civil government, and try to fend for ourselves in the state of nature, we get a pretty clear demonstration that Hobbes isn't completely talking out of his ass, because that's exactly what happens. That, like, it just becomes utter chaos. It's mob mentality for a couple of years, and that democratic revolution is short-lived. By the time 1799 rolls around, Napoleon comes to power, and a lot of those gains, those democratic gains in France, are basically erased. All right, that's what's going on in France. That's why Mary Wollstonecraft writes A Vindication of the Rights of Men. This puts her on the map intellectually. She's, like, taken fairly seriously amongst all of the folks who are offering political commentary at the time. She meets up with a whole bunch of folks, including a fellow named William Godwin, who they kind of, I suppose, they are, like, introduced and are somewhat like intellectual contemporaries, but they don't really like each other. That's important, because eventually they're going to get married. This is part of what would make this, like, a very cool movie. But, like, at first they're like, I don't like that person. They're like conceited. They're not very nice. They're, like, kind of difficult to get along with. And they become acquaintances, but not friends by any stretch of the imagination. Around this time, Mary Wollstonecraft is not just rubbing elbows with the likes of William Godwin. She is talking to all sorts of folks in the intellectual society in England at the time. She comes across a fellow named Henry Fuseli, who's an artist and is married. And Mary Wollstonecraft likes him. It's not clear if it's a romantic sort of a like or if it's a platonic sort of a like. But she likes him so much that she proposes that, like, they start living together. And he says, but my wife, and Mary Wollstonecraft says, like, well, she can come too. Like, I don't see anything wrong with that. And maybe there is nothing wrong with that. But William Fuseli's wife thought that there was something wrong with that. And I would say the vast majority of British society thought that there was something wrong with that. And he basically shuts her down. He says, no thanks, and then, like, has nothing to do with her. Somewhat embarrassed and kind of maybe, like, in a little bit of disgrace over this rejection by Fuseli, Wollstonecraft leaves and goes to France. This is a thing, apparently. Like, if things don't turn out very well for you in England, you can always go to France, where apparently people are totally okay with the idea of cohabitation and, like, polyamory and stuff like that. This is, after all, this is just shortly after the French Revolution. We have the beginnings of the Reign of Terror starting. Like, almost anything goes in France at this time. Wollstonecraft makes the acquaintance of an American adventurer / diplomat kind of guy. He, like, was an adventurer he helped settle Kentucky a little bit, and eventually in the newly formed American democracy gets sent to France as a diplomat on behalf of the United States. His name is Gilbert Imlay. He's an impressive sort of a character. Mary Wollstonecraft falls for Imlay, gets pregnant, says, hey, Imlay, let's get married and, like, raise this child together. And Imlay says, no thanks, and kind of, like, rejects her and leaves her on her own. Told you it was a little bit of a sad story. Mary Wollstonecraft takes on briefly Imlay's name, introduces herself to lots of people as Mary Imlay. When her daughter is born, young Frances, goes by Fanny, young Fanny, she gives her Imlay's name as well. And nobody's really the wiser. It's not until much later in her life when she decides to marry William Godwin that it becomes clear that she was never married to Gilbert Imlay. That it was the sort of thing that, like, oh, in order to get married, maybe we'll have to, like, dissolve the previous union. She's like, I never really was married to Imlay. And so she was going along this whole time with a child out of wedlock and pretending like she was married to this guy that she wasn't actually married to. Imlay kind of strings her along, like, refusing to actually commit to any sort of domestic life with her, but not really, like, saying, like, it's over, the same way that Fuseli did, where he was like, no, like, we can't really associate anymore. Imlay tries to get the best of both worlds, I suppose, to be the diplomatic kind of international playboy that manages to get all of the benefits of a relationship with Mary Wollstonecraft without actually having to commit to anything. We'll see some of that, like, going on in especially the later chapters, stuff about love and respect that happens in chapter 3. How does this go? Where are we now? I guess we're after 1792. She has this relationship with Imlay, kind of like on again, off again. Are they married? Well, she's pretending like they are, but they're not. She has a daughter. Is it Imlay's? Is he taking care of her? Like, no, not really. At this time, Mary Wollstonecraft is completely despondent. She ends up making 2 suicide attempts within the span of a year, both in around 1795. The first one is she tries to kill herself by overdose of laudanum. The second one, she tries to throw herself into the Thames River and drown herself. Between the 2 suicide attempts, she writes a collection of very personal letters that eventually gets read by that guy that we talked about before, William Godwin, who in reading those letters actually falls a little bit for Mary Wollstonecraft and is like, wow, I completely misjudged this person. There's something really intense going on. With her, like, psychologically and theoretically. He was, like, impressed not only with, like, the tenderness of her story, but the clarity of her thought. I suppose so. Well, yeah, maybe not. Well, close. They get together. They start courting. Mary Wollstonecraft gets pregnant again. William Godwin does the right thing and marries her. I guess this is 1797 at this point. As I mentioned, as soon as they get married, it becomes clear that she was never married to Gilbert Imlay, and she's kind of shunned socially. Both Godwin and Wollstonecraft, now Mary Godwin, are shunned by the rest of, like, British society, who are like, whoa, like, that's not cool that you were, like, that you had this child out of wedlock and now you have another child that, like it's not clear, like, what's up with this Mary Wollstonecraft woman? Eventually, Mary Wollstonecraft gives birth approximately 9 months later after she gets pregnant to her daughter, Mary, who's also named Mary, Mary Godwin Wollstonecraft. And Mary Wollstonecraft dies 11 days after childbirth from septicemia complications due to childbirth. So just as things, Jack was saying, like, oh, good timing, just as things, like, start to, like, finally line up into place for Mary Wollstonecraft, she dies. Her daughter, by the way, Mary Godwin Wollstonecraft, will eventually go on to marries William Godwin, has Mary Godwin Wollstonecraft. Mary Godwin Wollstonecraft eventually marries Percy Bysshe Shelley, becomes Mary Shelley, who you might recognize her name because she wrote Frankenstein. And both Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary Shelley are big, huge figures in this burgeoning sort of literary romanticism movement that comes on the heels of early modernity. This is an interesting pairing, not just because Mary Wollstonecraft has a famous daughter, but also because Mary Wollstonecraft has a famous daughter who's, I think, instrumental in this romanticism movement. And if you read the chapters that were assigned on the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, you'll know that Mary Wollstonecraft was anything but a romantic. We mentioned at one point that Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of straddled these 2 ideological movements, that he was a little bit in the territory of early modernity and the kind of like social contract theories that are characteristic of politics of early modernity, and that gets represented really, really well in the Social Contract, which we read. We didn't read some other pieces by him, notably a treatise on education called Emile, where Rousseau shows his more romantic side. And if you were confused a little bit by some of the criticisms that Mary Wollstonecraft makes of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, you can totally be forgiven for being confused by that because they seem out of place based on what we've read. This can be probably chalked up to a combination of a couple things. One, I'm not sure if Mary Wollstonecraft is reading Rousseau very charitably and is strawmanning his position a little bit, is making him seem more of a romantic than he actually is. He's a little bit more of a complicated thinker than that. But not only that, we only read a tiny portion of like the stuff that Jean-Jacques Rousseau read, and we didn't really portray him as much of a romantic as he is. The cues that we can get on this might be the sorts of things that we take from what seem like interesting but perhaps throwaway lines in the social contract, like the first one at the very beginning, man is born free but everywhere in chains. We get this picture of a very optimistic picture of this possibility of a really fully functioning civil society where everybody agrees with the laws and everybody voluntarily participates, with like what it would really look like to have government with the consent of the governed, the full consent of the governed. But again, we've discussed this a little bit. He sets the bar so high that we wonder, like, well, what of all of the real governments that don't actually accomplish the sort of thing that he's describing? And in plenty of other places, Rousseau is quite clear that like we would very well be better off in the state of nature than we would be in a bad civil society, in something that's masquerading as civil society but doesn't actually work. And you might also remember some of the things that kind of came towards the end of the portions that we read, where he describes how there's this sweet spot for a people where like they're only going to be receptive to the law, to good laws, under very, very kind of narrow circumstances. And one of the things that he mentions is you can have like maybe one revolution where like you had a society that lived under law and then didn't like the laws and then revolted and tried to make another sort of a civil government out of that. But if you do that too many times, it's just not going to work. The people lose faith in what law is going to be actually capable of. So this is another kind of maybe an indication of this latent and sometimes like fully blown romanticism in Rousseau, that he's got a picture of what a good civil government might look like, but it's so difficult to achieve. It's perhaps unsurprising that for the most part, Rousseau looks at actual governments and says like, yeah, we'd all be better off in the state of nature. And in that sense, he's a bit of a romantic. All right. That was a lot. Interesting story, right? Mary Wollstonecraft's life. It would make a really good movie, I think. A little bit, yeah. Similar time period, right? Yeah, for sure. Mary Wollstonecraft, in the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she is... That's not promising. She is arguing for a very specific thesis. What is that thesis? Sure, Corbin?
I believe the main thesis is that...
Somebody did knock on that, right? I'm not losing my mind. All right, sorry. Yeah, the main thesis?
I thought the main thesis from Wollstonecraft was that women need be taught equally in education.
That's it. Yeah, you thought it, and I agree. That's what I thought. Is that what the rest of you guys thought? Like, the whole point of this is that women and men need to be educated equally. And by equally, we don't mean like in the same amount. We mean in the same way. Women's education and men's education should be the same. Ignoring Wollstonecraft's bitter criticisms of Rousseau, there's an awful lot that they have in common. Rousseau is quite clear that like one of the values of government is that it educates its citizens such that they're going to be capable of being citizens of a good government. You can't have a good government without good citizens. You can't have good citizens without a good government. That's an idea that goes back as far as Plato's Republic. So this idea that government's function is like in large part educational is a relatively new idea. It's one that Rousseau is pushing. It's also one that Mary Wollstonecraft is pushing, and it's one that's starting to pick up some serious currency. I mentioned that Wollstonecraft was not only interested in the sort of private education that she could offer her wealthy employers. She was interested in getting into conversations about national education, about education being the sort of thing that government gets involved in. Perhaps we take this for granted today as like, of course governments have public education. This was not always the case. And we're beginning to see some of the arguments for public education coming about at around the time that Mary Wollstonecraft is writing this. As a matter of fact, one of the folks who's making arguments for public education is Monsieur Talleyrand, who is on the heels of this French Revolution. There's an opportunity to remake France in a much better sort of a democratic way that respects liberty, not just liberté, but fraternité and égalité. These are the slogans of the French Revolution. And Talleyrand is making arguments for public education as well. We might expect that he and Wollstonecraft are allies in this fight, except that Talleyrand is not advocating for equal education between men and women. He says the education for women should look very different than the education for men. Here's what he has to say. In speaking to the National Assembly in France on education policy, Talleyrand says, "Let us bring up women not to aspire to advantages which the Constitution denies them, but to know and appreciate those which it guarantees them. Men are destined to live on the stage of the world. A public education suits them. It early places before their eyes all the scenes of life. Only the proportions are different. The paternal home is better for the education of women. They have less need to learn to deal with the interests of others than to accustom themselves to a calm and secluded life." This is the conversation in France with respect to public education that's going on, and perhaps it's unsurprising that Mary Wollstonecraft, who is keenly aware of all the political goings-on in France and also interested in public education, is going to dedicate the Vindication of the Rights of Women to Monsieur Talleyrand, and not in a sort of a favorable way. This is a rejoinder to this completely ignorant thing that Talleyrand says. And this is perhaps the sort of thing that we would also that we would think today, this is obviously ridiculous, that public education is the sort of thing that would only be for men and not for women. But again, perhaps we should recognize that in 1792, this was not the case in the United States, and it would be quite some time until there was public education for women in the United States, starting with schools like this one. Furthermore, we might recognize that this conversation that's going on about whether or not men and women ought to be educated equally is still going on not so much about men and women, but perhaps about whether all sorts of people should be educated equally. Perhaps a liberal college education is the sort of thing that's suitable for certain sorts of folks, but other sorts of folks, maybe they need another sort of an education. Maybe a more, what's the word for it? Trade schools. Yeah, trade schools are good enough for some. And they don't need to spend, and it is expensive, right? Let's agree. It's expensive to get a college education, but maybe not everybody needs it. But a public education maybe is the sort of thing that everybody deserves, and everybody should get the same kind of public education. So be thinking in these kinds of expansive terms, that the thing that's radical about Mary Wollstonecraft is not necessarily about the gender equality stuff, which is totally radical for her time, but it won't strike us as radical today. In fact, there are going to be things that she says about the supposed equality between men and women, and note that she's saying that they ought to be educated equally. Is Mary Wollstonecraft saying that men and women are in fact equal? Not in every way. And in fact, in some ways, we might say I can see what she's saying. In other ways, she kind of leaves the door open in I think, shockingly conservative ways to the prospect that men and women aren't exactly equal, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't educate them equally. This is important if you're thinking back to a lot of the stuff that was going on in our readings of other social contract theorists, mostly because almost everybody else that we've read has built the equality of everybody under the law in a social contract on the supposition that we have a rough equality in the state of nature. We remember this? I've been kind of pointing it out as we go along. It started with Hobbes. Locke did it as well. Rousseau did it a little bit as well. Kant is also doing this in a certain sort of respect. And Wollstonecraft is going to play with this idea, but she's leaving the door open in a really interesting way to the prospect that men and women are not actually equal, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be equally educated. So she's opening the door to this prospect of equal treatment under the law, even if there is no natural equality. Pay attention to this. It's fairly important. All right. That's her thesis. What's the argument for it? Well, the argument for it is kind of scattered all throughout the chapters that we've read. So what we're going to do with the remainder of the time is we're going to kind of march through the dedicatory letter, the introduction, the stuff that happens in chapter 1, the stuff that happens in chapters 2 and 3, and then we're going to see if we can track back and figure out, like, okay, so what is, in the most concise sort of terms, what is the argument that Wollstonecraft is making for why it is that women ought to be educated equally to men, even if we entertain the prospect that, like, maybe they are not actually naturally equal. What's that? The virtues of men and women are the same. Perhaps not in degree. That's the, like, inequality, but in kind, right? Yeah, that's going to be a very, very big deal. All right. Let's start with the dedicatory letter. What's the stuff that, like, happens in that dedicatory letter? She opens up with a little discussion of manners and morals. In that conversation about manners and morals, Wollstonecraft makes what I think is like a pretty straightforward and plausible claim that manners should follow morality. The reason why we learn manners is because they're a rough approximation of morality. And maybe there are some manners that have nothing to do with morality directly, but it seems like almost all of the manners that we have are, if we wanted to read it back onto the sorts of things that we were reading in Kant, are ways of expressing a sort of respect for persons. Does that seem like it makes a little bit of sense? What's a little principle or a little rule that good manners suggest that anybody should abide by? Yeah, MK. Just saying please and thank you, yeah. Doesn't seem like, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say anybody has a moral obligation to say please and thank you, but in practicing the saying of please and thank you, it seems like it develops a sort of respect for persons, right? Does that seem like that makes sense? Holding the door open for somebody. I don't know if I would say you have a moral obligation to hold the door open for people, but it's a way of kind of developing habits that express a sort of respect for persons. And in this way, manners should totally be in the service of morals, but Wollstonecraft points out this is not necessarily the case in all respects. There are plenty of instances in which what's counted as good decorum, what's counted as polite behavior, seems to not only not be rooted in morality, but it seems to maybe even be contrary to morality. And this is nowhere more clear than the way that we think about, and we can think about this in terms of like 1792 England. We can maybe even think about this in terms of contemporary American society. The sorts of manners that we expect of women that are slightly different than manners that we expect from men. I'm just kind of curious, are we all on the same page with this, that like women and men in our society, while like everybody gets to vote and everybody has an access to an education and stuff like that, like the same expectations are not like, I didn't say that the right way. We don't have the same expectations as far as like behavior and manners for men and women. Naturally? Naturally? But that's not naturally though, right? If it's the sort of thing that gets socialized, then it's not natural, right? It's an artificial sort of a difference in behavior. Does that make sense? I guess, yeah. Well, that's just perhaps seems like the difference between naturally and not naturally. Maybe there's a natural difference. Maybe there's not a natural difference, but there definitely seems like there's a socially constructed difference. And the things that Mary Wollstonecraft is kind of drawing our attention to with respect to the manners that are expected of young women in 1792 England, and see if you think that this matches up with the sorts of stuff that we think today, is that women are expected to be docile, compliant, perhaps like especially polite, pretty, like objects of sexual desire for men. This is not the sort of thing that like happens today at all. There's no social pressure on women to be pretty that's like absent for men. There's no social pressure on women to like not be too abrasive, to be like easygoing and polite and docile in ways that like are not expected of men, because like if men act a certain way and women act that same way, like we don't read it slightly differently. No? Yes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? No, that's a thing? That's a thing? Yeah.
Because like if a girl comes down the road just like, walking with like no shaved legs, like just full on hair with her shorts on, someone's gonna look and just gonna, for some reason, they're just gonna think something negative and like just her legs.
It's noteworthy, right? Yeah. It's noteworthy if a woman doesn't shave her legs. Not noteworthy if a man doesn't shave his legs. Maybe noteworthy if a man does shave his legs. Yeah? Maybe that's just fashion, though. Is that a, I don't know, is that, yeah.
I went to Puerto Rico and I had some hairy legs. I talked to a guy and apparently he said that women like it when guys shave their legs. I was really surprised about that. I was like, whoa.
But maybe that's kind of one of the things is like, while all of us are a little bit concerned about like what our prospective romantic mates expect of us.
Women are expected to do so much more. It's not even fair.
That's a lot of service area.
Yeah?
That hurts my feelings myself.
We might even kind of like include this in sorts of behaviors that like for like a man it would be read as like confident and like, oh, he's the boss. And for women it's like, oh, she's bossy and bitchy and like that's like, was that what you were going to say?
Yeah, I feel like that's one of like the biggest ones because for like a public figure, like a leader or something, like you want like a male like a politician or something, like oh well, he's like but he's very bold. Or
He's no nonsense.
Yeah.
He speaks his mind.
Yeah, but then it's like oh she's like bitchy or she has like the resting bitch face or something like that.
Hmm.
I don't remember the last time like someone was like that dude has resting bitch face. You know?
Yeah, blood coming out of her wherever. Right, yeah. Yeah, so we are aware that these double standards totally exist today, right? All right. And that they happen in a very specific sort of way, where, like, Mary Wollstonecraft is not merely pointing out that there are unfair double standards, but that, like, what's crafted in these sorts of, like, ideas about, like, what a well-mannered, what feminine virtue looks like is a picture of women that is to be subservient, right? That is to be dominated. That's not like a picture of women such that they take control of their own lives, but a picture of women such that like they need to be taken care of by other people, and they shouldn't expect to be able to take care of themselves. And in fact, if they were to act in that way, it would be regarded in like with a little bit of a squinty eye, right? So this manners and morals thing sets up a conversation that's going to continue throughout the entirety. It's going to be in the introduction, less so in Chapter 1. We're going to see it all over Chapters 2 and 3 about the prevailing opinions with respect to sexual difference that basically could be summed up in this idea that like women are expected to be docile and innocent, right? We see this at the beginning of Chapter 2, that like they're expected to be like children, innocent, perhaps like domesticated beasts, in this innocence as well. And there are all kinds of like, maybe perhaps not feminine virtues, but feminine wiles that come out of this as well. Like there's that discussion of like women developing a certain sort of a craftiness, a cleverness, a cunning, right? Has anybody ever called you clever? What do you think of it, Jacob, when somebody called you clever? I had my writing described as clever once, and I was like, what's that supposed to mean? You took it as a compliment?
Yeah, to me it seems like it could be used if it's more used in like a crafty sense. It almost seems deceptive.
Yeah, like it's tricky, right?
But clever could also be seen as like quick-witted or like contemplative.
Yeah. I'd prefer words like wise, maybe, or knowledgeable.
I always get clever like, oh, you're fucking clever, aren't you?
Yeah, it's like there's almost like maybe smart ass or something like that. But maybe tricky, duplicitous, the sort of way. Yeah, Shai? Yeah, where cunning has this like not just connotation, but if you look it up in the dictionary. Did anybody look it up in the dictionary? Has like denotations as well of a sort of a deception sort of in cunning, right? Yeah. So this is the sort of thing that Wollstonecraft describes. I don't even remember where she does it because she's like dropping this conversation all over the dedicatory letter and the introduction in chapters 1 and 2. Where she says, like, women are not powerful with respect to physical strength like men are, and so they resort to something like physical strength, but with regard to kind of like craftiness and cunning, which is like, oh, like how clever they are, but that's a left-handed compliment, to be sure, right? It's not a legit virtue. This is one of the things that like comes up in the introduction as well, and it mirrors the conversation of manners and morals that the dedicatory letter to Talleyrand opens up with. And it's this idea of, false virtues. And she discusses these false virtues both for men and for women, but she focuses mostly on false virtues for women, these ways in which we get an idea of what femininity is supposed to look like, but it does not line up with what a flourishing human life looks like. It doesn't line up with the sorts of virtues that we would expect somebody to have if they were an independent, rational, human person, right? All right. So dedicatory letter to Talleyrand opens with this conversation of manners and morals. Oh, also in that conversation about manners and morals, did you guys catch this? There's a whole lot of shade thrown on French culture. Like a whole lot of shade. And we can imagine, like, this exists today, that, like, the French have a reputation for being bon vivants and, like, libertines and stuff like that. They have a kind of a cultural attitude that appreciates the sensual pleasures of life. Where there's a whole form of kissing named after them. Have you ever heard of British kissing? I haven't. Yeah, it does sound boring. Yeah, British kissing is like everybody remains fully clothed and like you shake hands across a table or something like that, right? Yeah. So yeah, the British have not only now, but like even at this time, a reputation for a sort of a reservedness, a temperance, a kind of like an exercising of self-restraint over bodily desire that Wollstonecraft is totally on board with. This is perhaps because she grows up in Britain. It's perhaps because she has a sort of religious piety about her as well. But she is incredibly critical of the way that French culture seems to capitulate to the demands of the flesh, right? And if we kind of want to track what else is going on in the late 1700s in France, it's not just the French Revolution, it's not just Monsieur Talleyrand. The Marquis de Sade is writing around this time as well, right? So you probably no more extreme picture of French licentiousness than the Marquis de Sade. And Wollstonecraft says this is toxic. And it's toxic to both men and women. But notice that it totally marries into this prevailing attitude that subjugates women as objects of sexual desire. When we think that sexual desire is the sort of thing that is to be capitulated to, then we will say that like men are completely entitled to try to bag as many women as possible. And women should be expected to be as attractive as possible to men. And if they're not attractive to men, well, good luck, ladies. I don't know. Maybe you could be a governess to children or something like that, but you'll never find a man for yourself. Folks will always string you along. They might knock you up, but they won't marry you. Yes?
In my medieval history class, there was a really weird thing they were talking about for women. They were talking about women in that age. People genuinely thought, at least priesthood thought, women were major nymphomaniacs. Because if you left them alone in a room with a man, they would get bangulated or something like that. But it turns out it's the opposite way, as we know now.
Is it the opposite way?
In general terms, sure.
This is like a big part of the conversation about like consent and sexual assaults going on in this country right now, where it's just like, like the young men, they can't control themselves because they're too sexually voracious.
It always went back to she tricked me. She used her cunning to make me do it.
To make me do it, right? It's not my fault. Yeah. Did you see how she was dressed? Yeah. But this is like insane, right? This is a problem for both sexes, and it's a problem of cultural morals and manners, right? It's not just that what we can imagine the French being like, well, but the British are too uptight and stuffy and don't know how to enjoy life, and maybe there's some truth to that. But the sort of licentiousness that Wollstonecraft is criticizing here, it goes hand in hand with the way in which women are treated as lesser than, as objects of sexual desire, and not necessarily the other way around, right? Okay. We get a great line from Wollstonecraft in that letter to Talleyrand where she says, if woman isn't fitted by education to be man's companion, then what? What's going to happen if woman isn't fitted by education to be man's companion? It'll stop the progress of knowledge. That's an interesting claim. Why is that? Yes?
I might be thinking this is from a different part, but I think this is like where
This is one of those rare occasions where it's okay if it's from a different part, because I do think that like Wollstonecraft is like hiding the bits of the argument like Easter eggs throughout like all of the chapters. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I feel like she goes into a narrative argument where she points out that it's worse for like people overall because like if women are like unable to take care of themselves if like their husband dies or something like that, then there's just someone that's not like helping to promote society. So when you like essentially train women to just be like
Objects of desire.
Yeah, exactly. Then they're not like helping to contribute to society and advancing.
Is this because like women should be like should they be like working in laboratories and being philosophers and like like doing the scientific work and advancing? Is this the argument that she's making?
If they don't have a husband, how would they raise a son?
If they don't have a husband, how would they?
How would she raise a son?
This like she frames this in terms of like women are like charged according to like folks like Talleyrand, and this is another one of those situations where it's not clear like if Wollstonecraft herself believes the sort of thing that she's saying here, if she like accepts this as like this is just kind of like part of how things are, that women are going to be the ones raising the children and men are going to be the ones out in public life. She doesn't necessarily challenge that idea, but she says even if that were the case, that women are the ones that are staying home and raising the children, how are they going to raise the children well if they themselves aren't educated properly? Like, how are they going to be a good companion for a man? How are they going to be a good mother to a man's children if they aren't properly educated? It requires that education, and like an education not just of like how to be a good mother, but like how to be a good anything, right? How's a mother going to raise a son if she doesn't know what it means to be a good man, right? So there's something about like this, it's the role in the raising of children, the role in being a partner to man that requires that a woman be educated the same as a man would, right? Educated in all of the same ways. And what is that way? Like how is it that they need to be educated? Because it seems like there's no shortage of opportunities for young women to learn how to be good mothers, I suppose. We don't need a national education program to teach women how to be young mothers. If we did, then it seems like maybe Talleyrand's right. They should have a separate kind of an education to learn how to be good mothers. Why should they have the same education as men in order to be mothers if we're never going to expect men to be mothers?
They need to be educated to develop reason.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, here comes reason. That recurring theme in not just philosophy generally, but like in early modernity especially. Like early modernity turns reason into this sort of like fetishistic object. Like everybody is like obsessed with reason. It's this thing that's at the cornerstone of everything that's done. Political philosophy. So this idea of reason as being the way that this education ought to be done gets articulated in the service of women being a fit companion for men, in the service of women being good mothers to children, and eventually she turns it into this conversation about like if they are going to be citizen subjects of a government, if you are going to expect them to comply with the law, if you are going to expect them to like find the station in life where they are best going to serve society, they have to understand why they should do the things that they're supposed to do there. You can't just tell them what to do and expect them to obey. You won't get obedient women if you just tell them what to do and don't explain why. And if you don't educate them with respect to reason, it's not going to be possible to like explain the reasons why. This seems like it's just a way of talking about how to avoid a tyranny. And this is maybe even like Rousseau 101 as well, that if you don't educate people with respect to reason. And the interesting new wrinkle that we're getting from Wollstonecraft is that while everybody might be, every human at least might be born with the capacity for reason, it's the sort of thing that needs to be trained. Not only does it need to be trained, but you can train it out of somebody as well. We got this in Rousseau as well, that there are people who are not born, nobody's born fit for slavery, But if you're born into slavery, you will very quickly become fit for slavery, right? If you teach somebody from the moment that they're born that they're not a human who's like capable of exercising their own reason, that they're just an object for other people to dominate and boss around, then that's what they're going to think of themselves. If you don't help them develop this tool, and in fact, if you beat it out of them every time they like try to use this tool, you say like, oh, sweetie, like don't do that, like you'll hurt your pretty head, then they won't develop that. And if you try to say that, well, this is for their own good, they can't be trusted to exercise their own reason, this is just garden variety tyranny. This is the same thing that like the whole 100 years of early modern political philosophy has been trying to avoid, trying to get out of. And it's the sort of thing that Monsieur Talleyrand is like diametrically opposed to tyranny. This is what the whole French Revolution was about. It was about ending the tyranny of the French monarchy. And Wollstonecraft points out that like this is the excuse that every single tyrant makes. Every single tyrant. Weak kings, weak fathers. Just obey because I said so. Don't worry about the reasons why. This is the kind of shit people say when they don't have good reasons why. Have you had this from your parents? Why should I do it? Because I said so? Have they said that to you? They could give the reasons, right?
They did. I just kept asking.
Oh, you kept why chaining them? Well, why that? Why that? Why that? And they got frustrated. And maybe because they were just like, now's not the time. Like, why shouldn't I put the butter knife in the light socket? And you're just kind of like, I'll explain later, but like, put the butter knife down first, like because I said so, right? Because I said so is never the real reason. This came up in the ancient class as well when we were talking about like, is something right just because God says so? And we're like, is anything ever right just because somebody in a position of authority or power says so? No, that's not really how this works. And it seems like when I resort to that, oftentimes I'm doing it because I actually don't have good reasons. Or for some reason, maybe I don't trust the person who is asking for the explanation. I don't trust them to be able to understand the reasons. But this sort of reference to the idea that like being dominated is for the dominated person's own good, or that it's for the sake of expediency. Wollstonecraft points out that this is the logic of like every single tyrant ever. And you of all people, Talleyrand, should know that this is not acceptable. What you are admitting when you say that 50% of the population needs to just obey and not bother themselves with explanations for why, is that some amount of tyranny is required in order for a fully functioning society to work. And I don't think that's what you want to say, and that's not what Talleyrand wants to say. That's not what hardly anybody who's talking about liberal democracy and early modernity wants to say. So in this sort of argument, which is like very, I don't want to say cleverly done, but is very, I think, expertly woven, even though it's maybe a little bit hard to track, we eventually get to this idea that like reason is required, and the training of reason amongst all of our citizens is required in order for there to not be tyranny. Because in order for people to be governed with the consent of the governed, they need to understand why things have to be this way. And notice that in doing this, Wollstonecraft doesn't make any arguments about like what the stations of men and women ought to be in society. Maybe it is the way that like it's been traditionally worked out. But she is maintaining that women are capable of understanding this reasoning. And if you don't develop that reasoning in them, all you're going to have is convenient slaves who are going to act up the moment you turn your back. And surprise, surprise, according to Mary Wollstonecraft, and I didn't know exactly like how women were acting in France and England in 1792, but she has like lots of not very complimentary things to say about the women of her day, where she says that's exactly what women do. You complain, like men complain about women, that they're sneaky and duplicitous, that they're like when they're trying to be complimentary, they'll say that they're cunning, but when they're not trying to be complimentary, they'll say they're sneaky and they're duplicitous, and as soon as you turn your back, they'll act up and they'll go stepping out on you and they'll find lovers and they'll cheat on you and like all of these things. And Mary Wollstonecraft says, surprise, surprise, you treat them like slaves even though they're capable of reason. If you could explain the reasoning for like why it is that they should act the way that they ought to act, then you would have them willingly fulfilling the sorts of roles that they need to fulfill. And there's a little bit of a dare in that as well. It's not just like, hey, you need to equip women with the capacity to understand their roles. She's also kind of laying down this challenge to say, like, and you need to be able to explain this. If you say that this is the order of, like, a just society, that women stay at home and men go out and handle the public business, you need to come up with real reasons. It won't do for you to kind of wave your hands and say, like, that's just the natural way of the world. That's an appeal to bias, right? That's an appeal to prejudice, which we get in chapter 1, this idea that, like, prejudice and bias and kind of bullshit appeals to tradition are the enemy of reason. That these are the sorts of things that even when we do develop reason in people, these are the things that shortcut our reason. These are the things that kind of reasoning. Reason should be dispassionate. That's what Kant was saying, right? That, like, if you're going to have a reasonable will, if you're going to have a truly free, pure will that operates solely according to reason, it has to have nothing to do with passion. Passion and prejudice and bias and how does Hume describe this as custom and habit, right? These are the sorts of things that get in the way of reason. These are the sorts of things that get us to abandon what otherwise might seem like good principles. These are the kinds of things that might block reason from intervening and determining what our action is going to be. And these are the sorts of things that, like, a little bit of bias or a little bit of prejudice mixed with a little bit of reason, that's like the worst combination ever. You have something that looks like it's reasonable, but it's really being perverted by some sort of prejudice or bias. All right, we'll get to that in just a second. I'll tell you, it's like it's scattered all over the place. So I think that covers that dedicatory letter to Talleyrand quite well. This is a nice self-contained little argument that manages to both insult the French and talk about equal education for women and talk about how reason is required for avoiding tyranny, like all in the same conversation. It just kind of like naturally flows. We get a very short introduction after that rehearses some of this material. The introduction talks about the miseducation of people in general, but of women in particular. And this has some consilience here with this idea of false virtue and manners and morals. We saw that kind of conversation that was going on before. That women are, it's not that they're not educated, it's that they're miseducated, right? Like, women are certainly taught to be a certain way. Mary Wollstonecraft doesn't think that, like, women by and large generally act the ways that they act because that's just their nature. She points out that this is the way that they're educated to act, and it's a miseducation. It gives them a false sense of what virtue looks like, a false sense of feminine virtue, and a false sense of virtue more generally. And this is where we get an excellent sort of a premise, mostly because it's beautiful in its simplicity and its obviousness and difficulty to deny. She says, hey, guess what? Women are human. Are they not? Women are human beings. They are like one of two sexes of the species human. And because women are human, women's virtues are the same as men's virtues. Does this make sense? Women's virtues are the same as men's virtues? I say this, everyone's like, yeah, the same. Like, being a good woman is the same as being a good man? At the time, no. Right now, no. And right now, yes? Yes. You guys either have way more progressive grandparents than I do, or...
Practically or theoretically? Practically.
This is the sort of thing that comes up to kind of like harken back to the ancient philosophy class again. There was a moment at the beginning of Plato's dialogue Meno, where Meno says, hey, Plato, is virtue teachable? And Meno says to Socrates, hey, Socrates, is virtue teachable? And Socrates says, I don't even know what virtue is. And Meno's like, I know what virtue is. And Socrates is like, you do? Well, go. What is virtue? And Meno's first answer is, well, there's a different virtue for everybody. Men have, like, manly virtue, and women have womanly virtue, and children have, like, their own virtue. Like, being an excellent child is not the same thing as being an excellent old person. Actually, those two, like, are kind of similar sometimes. Being a good man is not the same as being a good woman. Being a good soldier is not the same thing as being a good farmer. Being a good Athenian is maybe not the same thing as being a good Spartan. there's a different virtue for like every season and context and like kind of person and station in life. And Socrates says like, you gave me a whole bunch of examples, but you didn't tell me what virtue was generally. And Meno's like, I don't think there is a generalizable sort of virtue. And Socrates says, well, what about justice? Don't you have to be just in order, like if a woman's place is like managing the home, doesn't she have to do it justly? Doesn't she have to do it temperately and with moderation? And whatever it is that a man's virtue is, doesn't he have to do it justly and temperately and moderately? A soldier needs courage. Doesn't a child need courage too? It's not exactly the same courage, but it is the same courage. Like, does that make sense? It's the same, yeah. Perhaps different in degree, like what counts as courage for a child. If like there's an explosion and gunfire and the child runs toward it, and I'd say something like, that's not a courageous child, that's a foolish and reckless child. But if a soldier hears an explosion and gunfire and runs away from it, we might say like, whoa, you should have the chops to handle this, right? Or if it's a firefighter running into a burning building versus a small child, or versus me running into a burning building. It's foolish for one of us and brave for the other, right? But courage is the same thing regardless. It's that mean, and kind of jump from Plato to Aristotle real quickly, it's that mean with respect to the feeling of fear and the ability to stand up to it. So women need courage just like men need courage. Women need temperance just like men need temperance. Women need justice just like men need justice. It's the same virtues for everybody. Because we're all human. And it's all rooted in reason, right? That's the only way that you're going to get. And so women are human. Their virtues are the same in kind. In fact, there's a notable natural difference that Wollstonecraft admits right here, where she says, like, look, men are naturally stronger than women. Is this the sort of thing that, like, we're willing to accept even today? That, like, generally, while I might be able to find individual women who are stronger than individual men, generally men tend to be stronger than women? MK, what do you think?
I think women just have to work harder to be as strong.
They have to work harder to be as strong, right? So,
Scientifically for men to
yeah. There's a kind of like a natural biological ability of like men to lift more weight, all other things being equal, right? Like given the same amount of training, men are going to tend to be stronger than women are going to tend to be. Corbin?
Does this include dexterity? Because women have been shown to be better rock climbers than men,
That's
for
interesting.
example.
Huh. Yeah. So it might not include dexterity. Wollstonecraft is talking about physical strength mostly here. But this is perhaps a good example because, like, while men might tend to be stronger than women, strength, like in the abstract sense, is the same thing for everybody, right? It's the ability to like pick heavy shit up. And that's maybe not the greatest definition of like physical strength.
That's it.
But yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Exactly what it says.
Yeah. So like some people might be stronger than others, but it's not like strength itself is not this relative term that like there's a different kind of strength for men than for women. Like it's the same strength. We can say that about height too. Like what counts as tall in my family is not the same as what counts as tall in another family. But like tallness is the same thing for everybody. It's like extension in the up direction. Yeah, William.
I feel like, yeah, like, I mean, overall, yeah, like, men are physically stronger than women, but, of course, there's exceptions, but it's, like, I don't think it's necessary to, like, to just, like, not admit that kind of thing. Just, like, they used to teach in, like, equality seminars for, like, businesses that, like, you know, like, oh, I'm colorblind. But they don't teach that anymore. Now they're like, okay, we all have differences, but we're all, like, people. We're all equal in, like, the way that actually matters. Yeah.
Well, so what is this way that actually matters?
Well, I don't know, but that's the whole idea.
It could be with respect to like women are human, their virtues are the same as men's. These virtues are all rooted in reason. I'm going to have to shortcut some stuff because we get a nice little three-part argument about that in chapter 1, which like Wollstonecraft says, like, what is it that makes humans different from and superior to the beasts? It's the possession of reason. What is it that makes like one human better than another human? If like one human is in fact better than another human, it's virtue, right? Shit. All right. It's virtue, but everybody. Here's the thing about virtue: like everybody's virtues in the abstract sense are the same, and everybody falls short, right? None of us is like omnipotent with respect to physical strength. There are limits to it. But perhaps like we're all seeking to be as strong as we can while still being healthy, right? None of us is perfectly courageous. None of us is perfectly honest. None of us is perfectly temperate, but we're all trying to get there, right? Perfectible reason. We might even say the same thing. Like, reason is the same for everybody. Not everybody is equally reasonable, because not everybody's been trained the same way. And in fact, some folks might have, I don't know, maybe even cognitive disabilities that make it difficult for them to reason. Now, there might be some folks with such profound cognitive disabilities that they might not be capable of any reasoning at all. But this idea of virtue as a perfectible thing, and reason as improvable reason, that's a phrase that Wollstonecraft uses at one point. And that this is the reason why everybody needs to be educated in the same way, because everybody's virtues are the same, and everybody's access to reason, while there might be differences in degree, they're not differences in kind. This is why we all need to be educated to pursue the same sorts of things. Some might succeed more than others. For some it might be harder than for others. There might be, in this sense that Wollstonecraft was talking about, there might be natural differences of degree in the capacity to achieve human virtue for men and women. That's a huge door that she leaves right open. And when I read it, I'm just kind of like, like you could have gone for it, right? You could have said like, nah, they're like just. I would say that's probably what we think today, is that like men are not inherently more reasonable than women. Women are not inherently more emotional than men, although you hear people say shit like this from time to time. But we're all working towards it. And for that reason, everybody needs to be educated the same way. Everybody deserves the same sort of respect under the law with respect to education, perhaps as persons. This is the respect for humanity version of the categorical imperative that we got from Immanuel Kant. All right. I said I was gonna like double back to like the general argument. Here it is in 3 parts. I'm not even gonna write it on the board. Premise 1: women are human beings. Surprise! Make a bumper sticker out of that. Their virtue is no different in kind than men's, even if it's different in degree. And this is the interesting kind of progressive window that she opens up. This is now an argument that can be used for like a disability rights sort of a thing, not just women's rights. And it's rooted in improvable reason, and this is a kind of maybe a surprisingly sort of an instrumentalized version of like why it's important to educate women the same as men. When we fail to properly educate approximately 1/2 of the population, it's bad for everybody involved, not just the people that we're not educating properly. Like I said, next week, no mandatory class meetings. It'll be voluntary, and we'll be doing workshops for your final reflection drafts.